November 1942. The Mediterranean sky is stained copper by the rising sun, and below it, the largest amphibious operation the Allies have attempted so far begins to unfold. The code name is Operation Torch, and for hundreds of thousands of American soldiers crossing the Atlantic, it marks their baptism by fire, the first time U.S. troops will confront Axis ground forces on a continental battlefield. The convoys stretch across the ocean like floating cities. Navy escorts slice through rough Atlantic swells. Transport ships groan under their cargo of tanks, artillery pieces, crates of ammunition, and something smaller, almost insignificant next to such mass. Thousands upon thousands of squat, box-shaped vehicles no one outside the military has heard of. The soldiers simply call it the Jeep. Barely a year old, it is the youngest weapon on the roster of the Allied arsenal, born from panic and necessity. Designed in just 49 days by American engineers and mechanics, it was supposed to replace horses, motorcycles, and half a dozen obsolete scout cars. A patchwork of simplicity and genius. A 2.2-liter Go Devil engine delivering 60 horsepower, four-wheel drive able to claw its way out of mud, snow, or sand. A weight light enough to be manhandled by 6 men if stuck. For most troops boarding the transports in Virginia and New York, the Jeep is still untested myth, the little machine that allegedly can go anywhere. North Africa will decide if that's true. As the ships near the Moroccan coast, the crews stare into a dawn veiled with dust bearing the scent of oil and salt. The beaches ahead, Fidala, Safi, Oran, Algiers, shimmer under heat even before midday. There, Vichy French defenses wait uncertain whether to fight or surrender. The air vibrates with suspicion. No amount of drilling can prepare an army for its first real war. Beneath deck number 3 on the troop ship Thomas Jefferson, 24-year-old Lieutenant Ernest Thompson checks his checklist. Rifles, radios, canvas tents, and 12 crated Willys MB Jeeps lashed to steel decks with chains. Handle with care, stenciled above them, seems absurd. Each looks like a toy, compact and plain, the polar opposite of grandeur. But if the manuals are right, this machine can replace a cavalry platoon, carry a machine gun 1 hour, and wounded men the next, climb dunes, ford rivers, and run all day on bad gasoline while shrugging off heat that kills engines twice its size. No Allied commander is sure how it will behave in battle. They only know that the desert requires miracles. NATO's maps show beyond blank expanses labeled impassable sands. Mechanized columns sink in dunes, supply trucks overheat, tanks bog down. The Jeep, with its simple body and low gearing, is the gamble that bridges guesswork and logistics. At dawn on November 8, 1942, the first landing craft dropped their ramps onto Moroccan sand. Engines roar through surf. Men wade waist-deep, soaked in cold water, dragging cables and crates. From the holds come the Jeeps, lifted by cranes, lowered on slings like dangling insects into chaos. The moment the tires bite soil, history pivots. The Jeep sputters, coughs, then comes alive with a bark that instantly draws admiration. Drivers gun accelerators, propellers of prop wash swirl dust and salt together while officers shout coordinates. The desert baptism begins. The first hours are pandemonium. Confused firefights, misread flags, French artillery bursts sending columns scattering. Amid the blasts and rising heat, Jeeps dart between shell holes delivering ammunition, turning at impossible angles where trucks can't maneuver. Their short wheelbase lets them zigzag through burning dunes like metal foxes. By nightfall, Americans achieve something spectacular: mobility. Reporters embedded with the invasion write in astonishment. The smallest vehicle on the beach turned out to be the most useful. It ferries messages, drags disabled guns, and even hauls stranded sailors from wrecked boats. One driver recalls climbing from dunes so steep that any larger vehicle would have flipped backward. It felt like riding a treadmill that wanted to throw you off, but she just kept pulling. Yet beneath the success hides fragility. Gearboxes grind under sand fine as powder. Engines choke when air filters clog after minutes. Metal glows under relentless sun. Jeep crews improvise constantly, covering filters with socks, greasing spark plugs with excess oil, tying water canteens near radiators to keep them cool. The vehicle becomes as much human companion as machine. Soldiers give them names painted in white: Dusty Pete, Missouri Belle, Mudhopper. Behind front lines, engineers observe carefully, notebooks sweating with grease stains. They measure axle wear, temperature spikes, and performance across gradients. Every figure represents survival. By the third day, two truths have already emerged. Heavy armor fails fast in the African climate, but the Jeep thrives where men still walk. Its lightness becomes an advantage, where heat melts ambition, simplicity endures. From Casablanca to Oran, the Jeep spreads with rumor. Infantrymen trust it before officers do. They ride on fenders, cling to bumpers, share cigarettes through exhaust smoke. Combat photographers catch images that will define generations. Soft-topped silhouettes against vast dunes, American flags fluttering from whip antennas, drivers squinting through goggles behind endless columns of dust. The machine looks primitive yet unstoppable, the mechanical echo of the soldiers themselves, young, inexperienced, and determined. By the end of the first week, the Jeep has done something extraordinary. It has turned mobility into morale. Troops once chained to slow convoys suddenly roam independently. Patrols cover twice the distance, radio lines extend miles further, and rescue missions retrieve wounded men who would otherwise be left behind. This agile workhorse, the size of a kitchen table, binds the entire invasion together through speed. But the desert will test every myth soon enough. Beyond the beaches lies an immensity more dangerous than bullets, endless sand and the cunning of the Africa Corps. The Jeep will enter the real proving ground, a landscape built to punish ingenuity. By mid-November 1942, the thunder of the landings had receded, but the war in North Africa had only begun to show its teeth. The Jeep, barely a week into its first campaign, was now pressed deeper inland, far beyond the reassuring sight of the sea, into a geography that seemed to tear at both man and machine. Sandstorms lashed through the Atlas foothills. Midday sunlight hammered metal until steering wheels scorched bare palms. Here, under the merciless blue of the Maghreb sky, every design flaw and every act of ingenuity would determine whether the vehicle lived up to its legend. Mechanics working under canvas awnings near Oran soon learned that the Sahara was more formidable than any engineer's test range. Fine sand slipped through every seam. It fused to grease, turned oil thick as concrete, and erased the distinction between maintenance and survival. Each axle joint had to be cleaned daily. Soldiers joked that a Jeep's true engine was its crew's endurance. Filters designed for the mud of Louisiana were useless. Drivers improvised new ones from women's stockings, scavenged from Red Cross aid boxes, stretching nylon over hoods to trap the omnipresent dust. The Willys Go Devil engine demanded constant attention, but returned miracles when cared for. Its cast-iron block and simple carburetor ignored low-octane fuel that caused bigger engines to stall. On cold desert mornings, when Sherman tanks needed preheating torches, Jeeps started on the first crank, their exhausts steaming through breath clouds of men huddled for warmth. And in afternoon temperatures that climbed past 50 degrees Celsius, they kept running when others seized, though sometimes with radiators boiling like kettles. Mechanics began carrying extra water not for themselves but for the vehicles, canteens poured over radiators, mess tins serving as funnels. As Allied columns advanced east toward Algeria, the Jeep became their nervous system. It carried dispatch riders through minefields, guided columns along unmapped tracks, and shuttled portable radios whose long antennas etched silhouettes against shimmering horizons. Communication officers discovered the same principle tank commanders had learned too late. Mobility equals control. The moment a Jeep arrived, orders became movement. Without it, dust swallowed intention. American engineers from the 1st Armored Division began adapting the vehicle to roles never imagined in Ohio factories. Recon cars fitted with .30 caliber Brownings on pintle mounts, stretcher bearers with improvised racks welded to the frame, cable layers, even mini-fire engines for airfields. Experiment bred doctrine on the fly. At one captured Vichy airstrip, a sergeant removed his windshield, attached a 60-inch steel strip to the bumper, and used it to tow unexploded bombs off the runway. If it blows, he said, at least it's quick. It didn't. Each success made the Jeep harder to replace. When supply convoys faltered, soldiers hoarded spares like treasure, fan belts, spark plugs, wheel bearings. They coined new words, jeeping, meaning both movement and improvisation. In field diaries, officers wrote of Jeep miles rather than kilometers, measuring not distance but the stamina of this small mechanical animal. The enemy noticed too. German patrols learned that wherever dust clouds rose swiftly and unpredictably, Americans followed in jeeps. The Afrika Korps adapted by laying ambushes along wadis, dry riverbeds that served as natural roads, and disguising anti-tank guns with captured palm branches. The light vehicles could dodge artillery, but not shrapnel. Crews started bolting thin plates of scrap metal under seats to protect fuel tanks from small arms fire. Weight increased, agility decreased, compromises never ended. In late November near the Tunisian frontier, the Jeep met its first real duel with mechanized warfare. Recon patrols from the U.S. 1st Infantry Division encountered German SKF 222 scout cars, sleek, armored, turreted. The contrast was absurd. Thin-skinned jeeps armed with machine guns confronting steel predators. Yet terrain favored the underdog. When the German vehicles tried to pursue, their weight buried them in dunes. Jeeps circled like wasps, kicking up blinding dust clouds before retreating over slopes tanks couldn't climb. One American corporal radioed in disbelief, "We danced around them until they fired on ghosts." The engagement became a lesson taught across Allied lines. Mobility against armor, agility against intimidation. Night driving introduced its own hardships. Headlights invited strafing. Darkness swallowed everything else. Crews painted narrow vision slits on windshields and relied on phosphorescent sticks taped to fenders to follow one another like fireflies. Engines without mufflers echoed across valleys, attracting both friendly and enemy fire. In response, workshops cut holes in exhaust pipes to redirect sound downward, an innovation that spread across the theater. While the Jeep earned loyalty at the front, its logistical chain learned humility. Ship manifests had assumed a lifespan of 4 months per vehicle. Reality showed that each could survive a year if maintenance was creative enough. Tires posed the greatest problem. The desert shredded rubber faster than factories could deliver replacements. Mechanics discovered that camel leather, when nailed inside a worn tire, extended life by 300 miles. Soldiers called the hybrid Sahara retread. Commanders frowned at the improvisation until reports showed results. As combat reached the mountains of northern Algeria, terrain changed yet again. Dunes yielded to rocks sharp enough to tear differential housings clean open. Here, the Jeep's short wheelbase proved both savior and curse, agile on slopes, but constantly teetering on edges. Drivers learned to descend in low gear, never braking hard. The sound of slipping gravel became the soundtrack of ascent. Captured French guides admired the stubborn vehicle, remarking, "It climbs like a goat and dies like a man, slowly, noisily." Medical detachments transformed it into an ambulance with 2 stretchers mounted lengthwise above the rear seats. No suspension could soften the agony of wounded men bouncing through craters, yet it moved faster than any half-track. Pilots rescued from crashes in the desert called those makeshift ambulances life with wheels. Between November and December, thousands of soldiers owed survival to that crude arrangement of steel pipes and rope lashings. By December 1942, Operation Torch had achieved its strategic objectives. Casablanca, Algiers, and Oran secured, but the campaign continued into Tunisia, where Rommel's seasoned veterans waited. In this decisive stretch, supply lines stretched to breaking, and the Jeep became the only guarantee that communication between far-flung units survived. Convoys depended on them to scout ahead for mines. When bridges collapsed under heavy trucks, Jeeps crossed over planks or forded rivers using canvas tarps as makeshift floats. At least one was filmed floating 10 meters before splashing onto the opposite bank, engines still running. Mechanics began documenting these feats for engineers back home. Letters described clutch wear curves, suspension fatigue, and how the flathead engine endured dust ingestion better than overhead valve designs. Willys engineers in Toledo received these field notes by pouch, using them to improve oil seals and air filters. The vehicle evolved mid-war through feedback loops between frontline chaos and assembly line precision. Meanwhile, soldiers started to anthropomorphize their rides. They decorated dashboards with pin-up photos, ration stickers, and tally marks for miles traveled. Crews held unofficial competitions to see whose Jeep could cover the harshest terrain without breakdown. Victories meant pride letters sent home. She climbed hills where mules turned back. But admiration didn't prevent casualties. On the approaches to Tebessa in early 1943, German Stukas swept down in precision dives. A single strafing run could shred a convoy of open-top vehicles. Drivers learned instinctive evasions, jerking wheels, plunging into wadys, abandoning flat ground. Many Jeeps died there, twisted frames half buried in sand, a reminder that simplicity offered no armor against gravity or sudden fire. Still, each wreck proved something intangible, that a war machine could win even when destroyed. For commanders viewing from above, the sight of scattered Jeeps across hundreds of miles spoke of reach. An army that can move everywhere is an army that seems endless. By mid-December, Allied troops stood less than 500 kilometers from Tunis, their transport infrastructure held together by two ingredients: ingenuity and those tireless 1.1-ton vehicles. No staff column advanced without them. British and American officers, once skeptical of the American design, requested them in bulk. "We need more of those bloody fleas," one British major wrote. The term stuck: desert fleas, fast enough to sting but too nimble to be crushed. The Jeep had earned its credentials, but the worst terrain was yet to come. The high passes of the Atlas and the monsoon-like winter that would turn dust to liquid clay. Now the little machine that conquered sand would face its next ordeal: mud, mountain war, and the logistical labyrinth of unified Allied command. By January 1943, the Mediterranean winter arrived like punishment. The endless sun that had turned metal to molten pain now vanished behind black clouds rolling from the Atlas Mountains. Rain hammered North Africa with a fury unseen in generations. Floods turned wadys into rivers, tracks into mud pits, and supply routes into ribbons of drowning machines. In that chaos, only one vehicle consistently moved: the Jeep. Allied columns bogged down as soft clay swallowed half-tracks and 10-ton trucks. Tanks, once unstoppable on dunes, sank up to their turrets, their treads spinning helplessly. But the Jeep's narrow tires, minimal weight, and high torque let it crawl where giants died. Crews dropped tire pressure to 15 psi, letting the thin rubber spread wide over mud like snowshoes. Using ropes and boards, they inched through terrain that seemed impassable. "The rest of the army may need engineers," one corporal joked. "We only need patience and a spanner." The conditions birthed a new kind of discipline: mechanical intimacy. Drivers became mechanics. Mechanics became commanders of faith. Every man learned to listen to his engine like a heartbeat, muted when healthy, stuttering when thirsty, screaming when the clutch burned. Soldiers held their hands over hoods to sense heat through gloves soaked with rain. Repairs were done not by manuals, but instinct. One wrong decision under lightning flashes meant an engine drowned in mud forever. In Tunisia, where French colonial roads cut into steep valleys, the Jeep's agility outweighed armor. It redefined reconnaissance tactics. Instead of waiting for maps drawn by reconnaissance planes delayed by storms, commanders sent paired Jeeps flying ahead, crewed by soldiers with a notebook, radio, and courage. They returned with detailed sketches of passes, riverbanks, ambush points. Cartographers back at headquarters couldn't match such speed. The value of these tiny vehicles forced logistical miracles. Supply depots were reorganized around Jeep transport, creating new doctrines. A single 2.5-ton truck now hauled essential parts, tires, gearboxes, driveshafts, solely for the swarm of Jeeps that fed every regiment. Mechanics built mobile repair shops from captured French trailers. Inside, spare engines hung on makeshift cranes, cylinders gleamed under oil lamps. Each field workshop was a hive where the little machines came to be resurrected. Men spoke of reviving her rather than fixing it. It became an emotional contract. Jeeps were no longer inventory, they were companions. Soldiers adorned them with personality, shark mouths painted on hoods, bullet holes ringed with chalk like campaign badges, steering wheels wrapped in leather belts for grip. Some installed compasses salvaged from wrecked aircraft, or attached mirrors scavenged from civilian cars left in French garages. The Jeep evolved, piece by piece, through the hands of those who drove it. But as Allied divisions advanced east, another battle unfolded, one not in mud, but in coordination. Operation Torch had merged three armies, American, British, and the Free French, into a coalition without precedent. Each nation brought its own fuel standards, maintenance styles, and expectations. The Jeep became their common denominator. British officers admired its flexibility, but resented its left-hand drive. Americans swore by its engine, but distrusted British petrol. French resistance fighters simply painted tricolor stripes and treated them as symbols of liberation. This unintentional unifier rolled across every military culture, teaching soldiers to think less in doctrine and more in movement. At Allied headquarters in Algiers, frontline efficiency became obsession. Every dispatch from General Eisenhower's staff emphasized one phrase: keep the wheels turning. It applied as much to diplomacy as logistics. When politics froze between rival Free French factions, jeeps ferried envoys back and forth until disagreements thawed. When roads vanished, jeeps built new ones by sheer repetition, their tires compressing dirt into usable tracks that surveyors later mapped as official routes. The legend grew. Wherever one rolled, a path existed. Under Rommel's counterattacks, their limits were again tested. The German mastermind knew terrain like scripture and set traps accordingly. In February 1943, at the passes leading to Kasserine, his Afrika Korps cut through Allied lines with surgical strikes. Columns of jeeps carrying ammunition and wounded found themselves beneath screaming Stukas. Canvas roofs burst into flame, radios died with their operators. Survivors hauled crippled vehicles off roads, stripping parts to keep others running. From wrecks came donors. Axles, drive shafts, even entire engines ripped out in minutes. Allied survivors called them organ transplants. By dawn, fresh convoys rolled again, stitched together from the dead. The next weeks were brutal. Rain turned to dust again. Dust hid mines, and the air thickened with desperation. Mechanics slept beside dripping carburetors. Drivers repaired transmissions bare-handed in freezing wind. Yet the machines endured. In battle reports after Kasserine, the vehicles are listed not by number, but by reliability. 60% of light transports operational despite total chaos. The statistics meant life. When tanks stalled for fuel or morale faltered under shelling, the sight of a dusty jeep racing through artillery smoke restored a primitive confidence. Motion meant survival. For war correspondents capturing these moments, the imagery wrote itself. They filmed endless convoys at sunset, profiles etched in red haze, silhouettes of men perched on rolling fenders. Those photographs, later published in Life magazine, traveled farther than the battle itself. The jeep appeared everywhere, pulling field guns, dragging mules, carrying generals. It became universal shorthand for modern warfare: speed, adaptability, and the American will powered by combustion and grit. Behind the myth, engineers back home worked feverishly from reports sent by courier. The letters from Africa made technical poetry of necessity. Increase fuel pump clearance by 0.002, one officer scribbled. Dust will take the rest. Replace air filter elements with oil bath design. Current paper type suicide in desert. Detroit factories responded in weeks, producing improved versions. The Willys MB and Ford GPW, both interchangeable. Parts swapped seamlessly, proof that mass production and field intuition could exist as one ecosystem. That cooperation between soldier and factory forged a weapon greater than design: momentum. By early April 1943, Allied mechanized columns, restored and rearmed, launched their coordinated push toward Tunis. The jeep led the charge as reconnaissance spearhead. Drivers learned from local guides to read desert color. Bright gold meant soft sand, dull brown meant hardpan, dark lines meant salt flats, deadly to weight. They crossed miles of silence, punctuated only by the bark of unmuffled exhausts. Dust clouds trailed them like comet tails, visible for 20 miles. Axis aircraft tried to hunt by those plumes, but the vehicle's unpredictability made precision impossible. Within weeks, Allied maps blossomed with newfound roads traced by tire tracks. The Army's Corps of Engineers noted with astonishment that jeep patrols had covered more area than aerial reconnaissance units. The phrase, "follow the jeep tracks," entered operational briefings as a literal instruction for tanks following behind. Even Rommel admitted privately in later interrogations they are like locusts on wheels. You crush one, and there are 1,000 more by dusk. The war turned decisively. The Afrika Korps, once the personification of desert mastery, found itself hunted. American supply lines no longer stumbled, they glided. When fuel convoys hesitated, jeeps darted ahead to guide them past ambushes. When communications failed, they became human telegraphs, connecting regiments across terrain radio couldn't penetrate. Each success stacked proof upon mythology. The jeep wasn't merely transport, it was connective tissue binding everything together. But victory came with a toll. visible only up close. In the aftermath of Tunisia's fall, Allied mechanics surveyed surviving vehicles. Fewer than 1 in 5 had escaped serious structural damage. Frames bent from perpetual overloading formed V-shapes like bows ready to snap. Steering knuckles wore down to razor edges, pistons ran loose in cylinders, bodies resembled crushed tin under endless vibrations. Yet most still ran. "They don't die," a corporal declared. "They just sag and keep crawling." And crawl they did, into history. With Axis resistance collapsing, troops assembled for the final drive on Bizerte. Among the lines of tanks and trucks, the jeeps gathered like a swarm of old soldiers ready for one more march. Their paint blistered, seats torn, windshields cracked, but their spirits intact, mirrored in their crews who had aged years in months. For many, it was their first campaign, and they would never look at machinery the same again. They had seen a design become a companion and an idea become salvation. When Bizerte fell on May 8, 1943, marking the end of the North African campaign, Allied commanders credited logistics as much as bravery. Behind medals and statistics lingered one quiet constant, the unassuming 1.1-ton, flat-fendered, four-cylinder miracle that had carried the war across a continent. Montgomery phrased it best when he looked at a dusty column of jeeps readying for embarkation to Sicily and said, "That little car won this desert far more than I did." But before glory settled, one question remained in the minds of engineers and soldiers alike. Why had it triumphed when physics said it shouldn't? The Tunisian hills fell silent in May 1943. The smoke that had once blurred the horizon now drifted lazily over wreckage scattered like relics of a vanished storm. Around captured airfields stood the true monuments of victory, lines of battered, mud-caked jeeps, fenders dented, tires half-worn to fabric, windshields shattered, but standing upright as though unwilling to collapse. Mechanics and drivers moved among them in a kind of reverence. The war had ended in North Africa, but what it had forged here was more than victory. It had refined the very concept of movement in modern war. For many soldiers, it was inconceivable that the world's most powerful armies had come to depend so heavily on a machine no heavier than a draft horse. Yet every statistic confirmed the fact. From the landings at Casablanca to the final thrust into Bizerte, the average jeep logged 6,000 miles, burned 1,000 gallons of fuel, climbed gradients exceeding 45 degrees, and operated in temperatures ranging from near-freezing dawns to 55 degrees Celsius midday infernos. 9 out of 10 traveled without formal service for months. Those that failed were cannibalized. Those that lived became templates. In engineering reports, officers no longer referred to vehicles. They spoke of light mechanical infantry. When American and British design boards compared field data, the verdict was unanimous. The Jeep's simplicity had saved it. Its 80-inch wheelbase balanced weight perfectly between axles, distributing traction on sand where heavier vehicles plowed in nose first. The solid steel ladder frame absorbed twisting stress that would have shattered riveted chassis. Leaf spring suspension gave just enough flex to bounce through gullies without breaking. And the heart of it all, the 60-horsepower Go Devil engine, delivered torque at 2,000 RPM, a marvel of low-end strength that translation tables in German manuals later described with reluctant admiration. Back in Detroit, Willys and Ford engineers dissected the field reports with near religious attention. They read the mechanics' complaints about clogged air filters, then redesigned them into oil bath types that could breathe Sahara dust for weeks. They noted complaints about heat boilovers and responded by enlarging radiators, doubling their row count. The Africa package, as it was nicknamed, turned frontline improvisations into production standards. Within months, factory workers who had never seen the desert were welding lessons learned from it into the very bones of their next thousands of Jeeps. But while American machinery thrived on adaptation, soldiers carried different lessons, human ones. For them, the Jeep had become teacher, counselor, and mirror. It reminded them daily that survival belonged to the simple and the resilient. Private Harold Keene of the 5th Armored wrote home, "Every morning I check the oil and think that's all it takes to keep us both alive. Maybe war isn't about winning, maybe it's about keeping things running." After North Africa, as operations shifted toward Sicily, the Jeep left behind a moral as potent as any tactical innovation. mobility equals freedom. In letters exchanged between officers of the U.S. Tooth Corps and British Eighth Army, the same sentiment appears repeatedly, that small, reliable movement had done more for Allied cooperation than hours of diplomacy. A convoy of 10 jeeps proved universal, British drivers at the wheel, American radios in the back, French scouts navigating ahead. No translator needed. The little machines spoke the same mechanical language of utility. Strategists recognized it too. General Dwight Eisenhower later wrote, "America's war machine could never have pursued retreating Germans without the jeep. It was the lifeline, the link between orders and action." Famously, he listed it beside the C-47 transport, the bazooka, and the landing craft as one of 4 decisive tools of victory. Yet unlike the others, the jeep carried no weapon but speed and endurance. Its armor was trust. Engineers continued translating that trust into numbers. Field surveys logged power-to-weight ratios, climb gradients, and mean time between failure data. The average operational life before overhaul exceeded 1/200 hours. Independent mechanics noted that a jeep could be dismantled into 134 major parts with only 4 basic tools. On desert expeditions, soldiers timed themselves. The record for removing a gearbox was 42 minutes. Simplicity didn't just increase reliability, it democratized it. Every man became half an engineer. The jeep's influence began rippling beyond motor pools. Tactical doctrine shifted. Commanders realized that mobility created its own form of armor, unpredictability. Dozens of new units formed around that insight. Reconnaissance cavalry groups, raiding patrols, forward air controllers, all centered on jeeps. For every Sherman tank crawling across Tunisia, 10 of these humming little 4x4s were feeling the edges of enemy lines, turning warfare 3-dimensional with their reach. When journalists boarded transports heading home, they filled their notebooks with astonishment. The Associated Press correspondent John Herron described driving from Tunis to Algiers in a creation that feels drawn by pure optimism. His report concluded, "The difference between the armies of 1940 and 1943 is not numbers. It is this 4-wheeled promise that refuses to break." Photographers agreed. Life magazine's May 1943 issue carried a cover image of 4 jeeps in column beneath a caption reading, "The Face of Victory." The machine's profile, flat hood, round headlights, slatted grille, became instantly recognizable worldwide, the industrial equivalent of the GI's helmet or the nurse's cap. It symbolized functionality as honor. Even enemy engineers noted its arrival. In field reports recovered after the campaign, German commanders referred to it with grudging respect. One captured memorandum from the Africa Corps intelligence staff reads, "The American light truck displays impossible stamina. It travels where motorcycles overturn and half-tracks entrench. Recommend production of equivalent type should material allow." In Berlin, design departments studied photographs, attempting to replicate its geometry under the codename Light Kubel. Shortages of materials ended the effort before prototype completion. Meanwhile, thousands of jeeps remained across Africa, gifted or sold to Allied partners. French and Tunisian forces adopted them instantly for post-war rebuilding. They pulled plows instead of guns, ferried doctors through minefields, carried mail over the Atlas where horses once died. The same frame that had endured combat now carried food and peace. Yet for the men who had driven them through battle, attachment lingered. When orders came to ship surviving vehicles home or scrap them for metal, crews protested. Many secretly swapped serial plates or hid their machines behind dunes until demobilization, then purchased them through Army surplus contracts. It was the beginning of civilian fascination, the birth of the Jeep legend. Factories back home recognized the potential. Willys engineers repainted the name in bold cursive on radiators and showed demonstrators climbing impossible hills for newspapers, labeling it the Jeep, the vehicle that won the war. Civilians were invited to buy the same machine soldiers had trusted with their lives. They responded in droves. Farmers saw practicality. Veterans saw memory. In showrooms, salesmen said, "If it'll beat Rommel, it'll beat your chores." Still, within military circles, reflection turned technical. Formal reports concluded that the Jeep had rewritten operational mathematics. The traditional ratio of supply trucks to con troops dropped by half. Where 8-ton transports had once hauled provisions at 10 miles per day, Light convoys of jeeps now achieved 40. In warfare's equations of fuel, time, and reach, this change was revolutionary. Commanders likened it to giving every platoon the legs of an Olympian. The British Eighth Army adopted a saying, "If you can't see the jeep tracks, you're lost." In field manuals printed later, diagrams illustrated formation spacing, signal flags, and maintenance schedules standardized around its performance. Even Soviet observers, receiving a small number through Lend-Lease, issued reports praising its cold weather resilience, calling it a vehicle that treats terrain as suggestion. Technically, its strengths derived from balance and restraint. The engineers had unwittingly crafted perfection by knowing when to stop improving. No superfluous parts existed, no ornament could fail. Its rectangular frame distributed stress lines evenly. Its 6.016 tires struck equilibrium between flotation and grip. Nothing was beautiful for aesthetics, yet its silhouette became iconic precisely because it was pure. Art formed through necessity. As Operation Torch faded into history, historians and strategists tried to define what had happened on those beaches of 1942. The landings themselves were a triumph of coordination, but the enduring symbol wasn't a general's plan. It was the sight of a small, unarmored machine hauling the weight of an empire through sandstorms, minefields, and bureaucracy. In a final wartime interview, Lieutenant Thompson, that same young officer who had first watched the cranes lower 12 crated jeeps from the Thomas Jefferson into the Moroccan surf, summed it best. "The jeep never quit before we did. When the big guns fell behind, she carried their ammunition. When maps lied, she made her own road. When radios failed, she was the message." You can't measure a machine like that in horsepower. You measure it in faith. Faith. That was the invisible engine driving every bolt and tire through the deserts of North Africa. It was an engine that now powered something even greater, America's belief that ingenuity itself could outlast tyranny. From the beaches of Fadala to the ridgelines of Kasserine, the jeep proved an unassuming truth. Complexity collapses under chaos, but simplicity adapts. That lesson moved with every convoy into Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and beyond. Wherever Allied soldiers landed afterward, the first sound to break silence was always the same: the steady cough of a four-cylinder jeep announcing once again that movement meant hope. And when the last one rolled home, scarred by 2 continents and 5 years of war, mechanics washed the desert dust from its frame, traces of Morocco and Tunisia mixing in the runoff down American drains. On its hood lay the reflection of daylight, not the burning light of artillery, but peace's quiet shine. The jeep's baptism by fire was complete. It had survived everything the desert could throw and emerged not merely as a vehicle, but as a testament to endurance, a machine whose spirit outpaced even its steel. The silence that followed was not an ending, only the soft hum of an idling engine waiting for the next horizon.